Hey everyone, it's Terrence Branley with the Grow IT podcast, and today I'm lucky to have Noah Landau, who is the founder and CEO of Macktez, which is an IT consulting firm. And he just mentioned to me offline that it's the name of his mother. That was what was her? Is her maiden name?
It was her maiden name. Yeah, the slightly lighthearted story is my mother and her sister had no men in their generation, and so that name simply ceased to be anyone's last name. It was the 50s, 60s, and so when I started looking around to name the business in the mid 90s, one of the fun little moments was sort of casting about for something that was disconnected from technology. And A, the domain name was available at macktez.com, and B, it had this sort of nice sort of elegance. My mother's father and his brother had formed a textile manufacturing company in the 30s, I think, which they had named after their grandfather, which was called the Louis Macktez Corporation. So it became a nice little sort of inside kind of joke as an
That's
organization
a
to have
cool
this
story. That's a
weird
good way to keep the. I mean, granted, it's been since 1996, so it's a pretty good run. So it's a pretty good way of keeping your mom's maiden name still going.
absolutely. It's,
So let's talk about your background. Tell us about your entrepreneurial journey, both pre Mactez and obviously for the last 20 plus years.
the short version of a long meandering narrative here is I thought I was going to do architecture. I did architecture undergrad and did a lot of design work. I was actually very interested in theater. My business partner and I collaborated on a bunch of theater productions. One of our biggest projects was doing Evita, where we both ran sound. I did a lot of sound design as well. He's a fantastic soundboard operator. But we knew each other from college, left college, moved to New York with a group of friends, and started looking around at sort of the world. I had done a bunch of design work in San Francisco for a German company called Meta Design, which was a wonderful company. But my client for that design work was HP. And so I was doing highly technical design work. And I really kind of just found myself enjoying working with the designers so much more than working with the actual kind of tech people from HP that I kind of flipped the narrative when I got to New York and was like, maybe I should do technical things for designers instead of design things for technical people. And so for many years, for the first 10 years of our organization, most of our clients were creative companies, design, branding, architecture. That evolved over the years. A lot of the industry of like what it means to be an MSP and what it means to be doing technology is significantly different from what it was in the 90s, not surprisingly. And my business partner and I, and we're now about a 20-person company, and a lot of our clients are larger, not surprisingly, but they tend to be organizations that are sort of going through some kind of significant change. Either they're growing or they're kind of reinventing or they're overhauling. So sometimes it's like an organization that has a legacy of like kind of like has sort of abandoned technology and has sort of looked around and realized that they've had some security issue and need to overhaul. Sometimes it's a whole new organization that's growing up from scratch. And sometimes it's, just organizations that have done some really great stuff, but just realized that they've sort of like haven't kind of kept the technology kind of modernized. And it's an opportunity or a time to kind of like take a look at that stuff and be like, hey, let's really bring this into the modern age. There's also such fascinating things happening now in technology with cloud first and remote that there's a real kind of additional kind of individual, almost like end user drive for some of this stuff. It's gratifying to see.
So let's talk about some of the different clients you have and maybe the different industries or sectors they're in, some of the different challenges they're experiencing, or some of the different things they're facing. You kind of mentioned that your clients are typically in a state of change, right? Whether that mean growing, contracting, whatever it may be. But maybe kind of let's like delve into a few different areas in terms of maybe size, industry, et cetera, and kind of work from there.
So I think one of the funnest ones to talk about, partially because of the kind of the length and evolving nature of the relationship, is that we have a client called Little Island, which is a completely artificial park that was built off the coast of Manhattan just a few years ago. Kind of an amazing, epic. They literally built these giant concrete plinths, floated them down the barge on barges, floated them down the river, and then built them on these pylons. The entire park is like floating on these lily pads. It's a truly amazing and remarkable. The landscaping and horticulture is really fantastic, and they have a great amphitheater and a really wonderful programming. It's just sort of like kind of amazing to have an entirely new park kind of come out of nowhere, literally out of the water. But we first became involved with that project because they had as many of these projects do, and engineers and a lot of different people that were involved during construction, and kind of a number of members of their team looked around and said, it feels like there's a gap here. It's like that person is speccing the wireless system and that person is speccing like the box that this thing goes in, but like who's responsible for making sure that stuff actually works and is like the right size and has like the right temperature requirements. And so we got pulled into a series of conversations, and we were like, oh goodness, there's some pretty big gaps here. Like, how are you going to power that piece of equipment? There's no power in this box. And like, how are you going to cool that piece of equipment? It's like, and this piece of equipment is a box that's hanging over like a salinated river, that has like all sorts of environmental conditions. Like, well, how are you handling that? So we got involved in a way that we often do to do some like actual real hands-on network design, some thermal consulting, working with the actual engineering and concrete team and the electrical team to sort of like reroute power cabling and ensure that there was redundant power, working with the ISPs to try to get an ISP who would run fiber across the West Side Highway. Not a trivial undertaking. Pilot Fiber was a superhero for digging up that stuff and crawling around on their bellies to get that done. And the end result of that is obviously creating, the sort of like the technical infrastructure, the physical stuff and the configurations necessary for all the firewalls and switches and wireless and cameras and blah, 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 to kind of all work together. In the end, once that stuff is all kind of working, and again, there are many organizations who will kind of like put together a design and walk away, and there's many organizations that will take a design and come in, but we're a little unusual in that we'll do that, and then that carries all the way through into the actual ongoing operation. One of the interesting things about this group is that they were kind of recognizing that they have a very high staff change. They sort of on and off board like 50, 60 people every year because they're essentially a park that doesn't have a bunch of the staff, doesn't have anything to do during the winter months. So they kind of hire a huge chunk of staff, like double maybe in the summer. And so some sort of like modern identity management, onboarding, offboarding process automation was really, really valuable. So some of our work evolved from this like physical, construction meeting kind of work into workflow identity and kind of managed systems. And then just, all the usual stuff that comes up when you're doing that. How does that integrate? How do you ensure, privileged access is maintained and logging and data capture? So that was a really interesting relationship that now our role with them is really a traditional MSP. We have a person who works closely with our operations department and handles all their day-to-day IT stuff, and account manager who does quarterly kind of conversations. But that's a great example, I think, of an organization that was going through a set of very complicated technical changes, and it was very difficult to say what the actual problem was that needed to be solved. And our involvement helped sort of them both chart that path and then find the solutions, implement the solutions, and now sort of maintain those solutions over the long term, year after year.
That's interesting. I hadn't even heard of that. I'm gonna have to look that up after. So, like, what about in terms of business sizes? Like, where do you see that? And maybe it's just with the folks that you're talking with, whether it's prospects or clients. Are they your typical SMBs? Are they more, are they some crossing into, the mid market?
That's a great question. So,
I assume enterprises kind of has their own, but like probably in the SMB mid market, maybe if you can kind of delineate.
yeah, so that's an example of a relationship in which we functioned, or we function as sort of the only IT resources, where we really are an MSP. So they're small in traditional sense. They're 50 to 120 or so, depending on range. Somewhere in there, it might be a little bit, maybe it's 100, but they're somewhere in that range during their seasonal sort of like swell and shrink. Another organization we work with or worked with in a different capacity is now called Ultimaker, but was at the time called MakerBot. And MakerBot sort of was famous many years ago for being one of the first sort of like DIY 3D printing companies before that was a big thing. And MakerBot actually started in Brooklyn, not far from here. Started off as sort of like a rep wrap kit that you would buy, and then evolved, and it eventually was bought by a company called Stratsys, which is a European company, and does like super high end, very, very elaborate production style 3D printing for manufacturing. But MakerBot still does sort of this much more sort of accessible, much more kind of consumer friendly stuff. And we got involved there. They had 3 full-time IT people. They're a few hundred people, great organization, but their IT had just, because of a number of staffing reasons, had just sort of like kind of gotten a little bit abandoned. Their firewalls had sort of expired, no longer had coverage. They just sort of had a situation where the junior people were great, but didn't have the experience to know how to like manage the infrastructure. And the person in charge of managing infrastructure had sort of ended up really kind of devoting all their energy to sort of like project managing a series of projects, and kind of found themselves kind of over their head a little bit, and then ended up moving on. And suddenly there was this sort of vacuum where it was like their entire network closet was a spaghetti sort of gobbledygook of just like stuff, confusingly configured with unclear how the data protection was even really, if it was what the DR plan was, and the whole question of like how that related to cloud projects and the Wi-Fi in the office and video conferencing. So that was a project where we came in, worked with their in-house IT staff. We actually helped hire and train 2 additional IT staff people, trained 1 junior person up, and then helped hire an IT director and bring another junior person in. And our role there was really kind of collaborating with their in-house IT to build out the infrastructure. We did a pretty elaborate chunk of planning to basically rip out their entire machine room and reinstall their machine room, which involved about 6 months of planning, including a very complicated process with the building. They're in a large building in downtown Brooklyn called Metrotech that required a whole new power circuit to be run by Con Ed. And that required obviously months of permitting and review. And we sort of managed that entire process, obviously with contractors and some other specialists. But like overhauling the power protection and the server architecture, that was also an interesting example of one where the like catalyst switch architecture had sort of we reused a lot of equipment in order to like actually hit reasonable budgets. We were able to basically say, hey, this equipment isn't really the ideal equipment, but we can make it work so that you can put your money into this piece that has like real high value proposition. So that was a very interesting example of one where the hundreds of people in the organization, but we weren't acting as an MSP. We were acting more like sort of helping them navigate this change. Now there were periods when they were low on staff where our kind of like help desk would step in and provide coverage. There's a few months where we had a person embedded there essentially covering while somebody was on leave. So it's an area where, again, like Little Island, the relationship sort of changed over time, but they were much larger. We have a couple of other clients which are quite a bit larger, like 1,000 people. And again, for those larger clients, we're not really functioning like a managed service provider. We're more functioning like a collaborator. A big part of what we do for these organizations is sort of help them to kind of expand what they're capable of doing without the sort of impossibility of hiring a gazillion specialists. They can kind of bring us in, and they have the equivalent of hiring 20 different people with lots of different expertise, and also they don't have to onboard us for HR, and we have our own project management team, and our team is sort of fully up to speed and collaborates effectively. So it's a big part of our scale. To answer the question you actually asked, is probably at the smallest end. We do have clients that are only a few people, but most of our clients are in that 10 to 30 person range. And then most of our clients that we're doing this sort of bigger lifting are obviously more in the 50 to 300 range. That's probably the typical area where we see some real gaps and need.
Do you find that, as we talked about in the beginning, that your clients are coming in with there's change that's kind of in the background, whether it's up, down, and some of it can even just be just the acceleration of technology. Just in the last 20 plus years that you've been around, right? You went from
Absolutely.
people from the internet coming into the business world to then all of a sudden then people making decisions about on-prem versus the cloud. Now we're talking about AI, and that means cleaning up data. It's like, the acceleration has been what's probably driving a lot of both the need for change, up or down, right?
Yeah, I mean, the changes we're seeing, over the course of 27 years, we sometimes talk about it like cycles. Like it doesn't seem to be a linear acceleration. Certainly, it seems like it accelerates and then it like slows down and then accelerates. So, whether it's a 5-year cycle, I don't know that there's any real rigorous timetable, but there are these periods where it feels like there's expansion and contraction. Over that 25 years, there's been these periods where larger organizations outsource their entire IT department to some other country, and then whole areas where they bring it all back in, and then they outsource a piece of it and they bring it back in, and then they break up into SaaS products and they bring it back in. So there are these sort of like cycles, I think, in the technology industry of like trying different tools and different processes. The areas that I think we're seeing a lot of activity in right now are the sort of navigating the ramifications of some of the cloud and remote components. For example, one of the stickiest issues for us to deal with sometimes is an organization that has a kind of a legacy hybrid AD where everybody worked in the office and now they don't all work in the office. They're now kind of either fully remote or partially remote. And suddenly it's like, well, we'd really like to basically unbind them and rebind them to this to Entra or to Jump Cloud or some other identity service. And it's like, how do you do that for 200 people that are scattered around the planet? Most of them aren't anywhere near an office. Do you like wait till they all come together and try to do it on a week? Like, how do you do that? So sometimes the issue is like an internal team just doesn't have the manpower to pull off, doing 50 machines at a time. But, we can bring in a crew of 6 or 8 people and do that all in one chunk. A lot of times what that practically means is that we're sort of trying to meticulously plan, and having done a number of these before, particularly in the sort of identity transition, I feel like that's a really, really big part of where a lot of activity happens now. This idea that systems are cloud-based, like SaaS and all that, but also that identity management, that the idea that like you as an individual is the primary tentpole of internet security and system security. One of the big transitions that I think we've seen over the last 10 years is from this sort of tentpole of device management, the idea that like BYOD and you have an encryption profile and a certificate and all this stuff that happens on your mobile phone or your tablet or your computer. And I feel like it's comfortable to say that there's still important things happening, and we still use a bunch of tools that allow us to manage that side of things. But more and more, our conversations now are about the identity, about a person, what services are bound to that person's credentials. Single sign-on, Okta. We use Jump Cloud a lot because it's particularly great in a cross-platform cloud-first environment. But there's some great tools out there that are just so much better at that than the tools that used to exist 10, 20 years ago. Zero touch and all that kind of MDM and kind of remote configuration stuff has gotten just like much, much better of late.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. You just talked about just now what seemed like more of like a hardware or product, method for providing security, and now kind of transferring some of it over, not necessarily to the person themselves, but kind of a combination thereof, and just all the technology that has changed with regards to that. I'd imagine that can be overwhelming even for an organization to be like, hey, where do we start type of thing.
Yeah, I think it's tricky in part because, you can do a certain amount of the device part kind of, kind of silently under the hood. You can be like, here's a new computer. It looks the same. Don't worry about it. But you can't do that for the identity. The identity requires by definition, you want that person to know their own credentials, and you don't want to know their credentials, right? The central tenet to like a good identity management, proper security model is that each person has an actual secure identity that they and only they know. So there's the second factor, additional multi-factors, whatever protection. There's a lot of interesting stuff that happens in the like, AI threat prevention model, but really the most tricky, maybe the most exciting component, I think, is that phishing is, I think, one of the great examples of like a person, an individual person, whether they're the CFO or whether they're the intern, needs to have this sort of point in time where they're like, wait, should I really type my password in here? Is this a good idea? And so when we talk about identity, I think we're not just talking about IDP, which is like a Jump Cloud or a software product that does a bunch of stuff to make this identity effective. We're also talking about the idea that you're investing in training, and maybe you're doing behind the scenes EDRs like Huntress or something, or maybe you're also doing a set of kind of like phishing, testing, prompting, training. There's a bunch of stuff we use like Breach Secure. So you can use these sort of tools out there to help like verify and test and encourage the individuals to get better and to grow and to recognize like, oops, I shouldn't have pressed that button, or I should recognize that this thing is probably suspicious. I think one of our most common sad, frustrating moments is when we get brought into a conversation where somebody has either been duped into like wiring money to the wrong place, or has entered their credentials and realized that they've lost access to their account. And there's just comes a point of no matter how tight your security is, you still need the individual to recognize that like, hey, wait a minute, it's difficult to make that sort of something that happens without the participation of the staff. So good news is I think people are better and better at that.
And I think they have to be. I think to the point, right? It used to be. I think that you'd have the devices, and to the employee, you'd say, "Hey, don't worry about it. We've got it all on the back end. We're going to make this idiot proof for you, right?" To where now you can't afford to. You have to make sure the individual is part of that security mechanism. And there was a story I heard not too long ago where this is probably like a 500 employee company where a C-level CFO had published something in terms of a new partnership that they had done with a vendor. And so someone had used that to basically send a phishing email to the CFO to say, "Hey, you were supposed to wire us a certain amount, X, what," and referenced it. And the CFO did it. He actually sent it over and felt really, really dumb. But it was a good learning example in terms of, hey, this can happen at the highest levels, and
Yeah, we've seen just that's a disturbing and an impressive example. But we spear phishing, of course, which is this like highly targeted kind of phishing where sometimes we see like somebody lower levels account has been compromised, and that's then used to have a very plausible series of interactions with somebody else, who then leverages that to have to get a phishing account, and then leverages that to sort of change an account number on a PDF on the file server. So we have seen a few of those where it's been like, wow, that was a very elaborate and complicated hack.
And now that you say that, and I hadn't heard the spear phishing term before, but I like that. But that's exactly what it was. They had actually hacked someone in accounting I think, into their email address and then used that. It was so sophisticated that I was like, wait, how did they pull off? And that sounds like what it was.
Yeah, I would say that some of those attacks that we encounter are not as sophisticated as that. Some of them are just sort of like typo email addresses. You register a domain name that's sort of like close to but not quite the same, or you send a text message from somebody claiming to be your CEO who isn't telling you to buy gift cards. It's like the volume of that is not small, and the sophistication is tricky. It's often out of band. So part of that, I think, is we talk a lot about technology isn't just computers. Like technology is like all of the tools we use. And so we talk about like, hey, that's one of those examples where out of band communication, like you as an organization need to recognize that like having your CEO text you and tell you to buy $1,000 worth of gift cards is a red flag. And like, if you don't have an out of band way to communicate with your CEO and you don't have a way to verify that's them, you need to reach out to somebody else and verify like, hey, I'm being asked to do this. This seems weird. Like, can I get a phone call with the CEO in order to verify they really need this? And it's like an interesting element to like, having people recognize their discomfort and kind of acknowledge that like, hey, my alarm bells are going off. This is weird, but also feel empowered to be like, if goodness, some CEO does something wacky like that, to recognize that like, hey, that's you need to be clear. That's not a behavior that is appropriate. Like if you do that, you're going to set your team up
Boy,
for
I'm glad I'm
failure.
not him.
Indeed, indeed.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit to growth, right? For IT, so podcast wouldn't be the same without talking about bringing some of the growth initiatives. Obviously, you even mentioned having clients who you've helped through growth challenges. What are some of the challenges that you've encountered? I mean, you've been around for 25 plus years. There's anytime you grow, there are challenges. What are some of the challenges that you have faced and are facing in terms of growing Macktez?
That's a great question. I mean, we talk a lot about grow and growth in terms of clients, but when we talk about ourselves, I think there's been a real, I don't like to say paradigm shift. I think that's overused, but there's been a real kind of recognition of the difference between success meaning a lot of people versus success meaning like doing really good work. And I think a big part of the way that we kind of evaluate success is sort of like, do clients trust us? Have we earned their trust? Have we justified earning their trust? Do they like when we say things? Do they believe us? And also like are we successfully doing these things that we want to do and that they want us to do? And adding a lot of people, doubling in size, is not a great recipe to make everything that you do super high quality. And I think we had a period where over the last 10 years we grew. We're about 20 now. We grew up. I think our largest was close to 30, and we definitely found ourselves struggling at 30. We just were the quality of the work we were doing wasn't as consistent as we wanted, and so that coincided with a little aftermath of COVID and a bunch of other challenges, and we ended up deciding to sort of pull back a little bit and restructure the organization. And so we're a little smaller, a little tighter. I think a lot of organizations like ours recognize, and I think for us, it took me a little while to get my head around this, that it's sort of fun and seems sort of like exciting to have a lot more people, but really more people doesn't translate into better quality work or frankly, more scalable systems, especially in this industry. I think a big, big part of being effective and growing your revenue and growing your projects is basically like having um, the right mixture of team members and having enough capacity available in those team members so they're not stressed and they're not overwhelmed, but also kind of taking advantage of tools and systems and resources. If you have two clients, one of whom is taking you like 80 hours to do something and another client is taking you 20, and you're charging them both the same amount, like there's a moment there where you have to pause and be like, well, what's happening here? Like, can we fix that? As opposed to saying, hey, I just need to hire more people, and more work is more work, it's all great. I think a big part of our process, and I give a lot of kudos to both my partner, COO Michael Horst, and also our director of technology services, who's fantastic, who really thinks a lot about this idea of like, hey, how do these mixture of human beings do great work? And I think he's got incredible SLA metrics from our team, and not a small part of what we've ended up doing in the last few years is actually going into other organizations' help desks and trying to help them improve the way that their help desk works through figuring out which metrics to use and which metrics not to use, kind of recognizing like what kind of tool sets are worth the money and which ones are not, and also kind of setting expectations about kind of what the rest of the organization can reasonably expect from IT, and kind of how to communicate back out what those expectations look like in the real world.
Well, as we talk about the human asset side of the business and the biggest trend, which is obviously AI, right? And let's talk about that because, and again, not from the sky is falling type of thing, but really how AI can help, the human assets side of business run more effectively, efficiently, deliver better results for clients, and really to be that exponentially important tool in the business toolkit. What are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of the trends, both in your business and that you're be able to apply, help in applications for clients, as well as where you think things are going?
I think it's a great question. It's funny. We actually have a tech talk. We do a tech talk series called Tata Tech every other month, physically in our office. It's like kind of like a fireside chat format. And the December one is specifically on AI. It's got a little bit of a witty title that's a homage to Dr. Strangelove, because I think there is this sort of interesting question of like, where is AI going? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Like, is it a mixture? I think we're kind of at this very interesting moment in time with AI, where a lot of different things are called AI, sort of like blockchain and crypto. It's like I think it's attracted an enormous amount of attention, even if it's great, probably still an outsized amount of attention. And I like to like to use machine learning as the term, because I feel like that's a slightly kind of slightly more a less sort of ambitious. I think artificial intelligence imbues this sort of idea of sentience for a lot of people, particularly AGI and artificial general intelligence. And I do like to sort of bring that back a little bit and be like, there's a lot of potential, but there's also like there's some really things that it's quite good at doing now. Recognizing that it's sort of good at kind of being a bit of a showman and a salesman and kind of like
Mm-hmm.
making stuff up, but in a pretty good way. I think it's like there's a sobering quality of recognizing that like the stuff you get back from it is sort of like, at least at this moment in time, it's sort of like the best intern you've ever had or a great EA. It's like you don't know that they're a subject matter expert in this area. That having been said, I do think there's a bunch of very interesting trends where the sophistication of motion, you and I were talking about this a few minutes ago, the sophistication of like the emotional modeling, so that it feels like you're having like a very emotional conversation with a person, even though it's not a human being, not a human person. That I think is sort of eerie and raises some very interesting questions about like what it means to like model behavior and be empathetic and to share ideas. There's obviously lots of great science fiction writing on like what happens in these kinds of moments when artificial intelligences. My advice would be, if in doubt, Ted Chiang, who's a pretty fantastic science fiction author who not only has a bunch of really great stories that deal with some of these delicate issues, but also has written a bunch of really wonderful essays that are extremely like very real, very present. His essays talked one of the I think his best essays is that a lot of the fears of AI are actually better framed as fear of capitalism, and recognizing that a lot of the like when you actually sort of unpack some of the concerns. Similarly, as a great article on this idea of sort of like AI in its current form as sort of like a lossy JPEG of the web, which is a very interesting kind of vision of like when you think about like original writing and you go on some website and you're like, oh, a person who was an expert wrote this, but like, did they, or is this some sort of like very convincing sort of, multi-tiered extraction that's re-summarized from 4 different documents? So I think we're, all that is to say, a very interesting point in time. I think the next probably 2 to 18 months, we'll have some really interesting, frankly, unexpected developments in AI or machine learning. I tend to approach it with a little bit of caution, and I kind of feel like, using it as a set of tools. I have a couple of friends who use it almost like like a neighbor, like they kind of have a banter. They keep kind of sort of a chat bot going all day. And like when they're like, hey, I'm thinking about this marketing plan. Like, what do you think about this? And I think there are examples like that, and like the ones that Ida and I will be talking about in December, which are super compelling. Partially because they don't require the kind of content produced by the AI to be super factual. It's really more about like bringing ideas. It's like a therapist. A therapist is sort of asking like, what do you think? And sometimes your conversations with AI, I think, can have some of that quality where it doesn't really matter. It's where you get to that is most important. But I think we'll continue to see improvements in expertise and efficacy and in accuracy. There's been obviously even just the models that were released a few days ago have even more impressive sort of expertise. So I think the funny part of all that, of course, is a lot of AI is sort of a black box. We don't really. It's difficult, even for an expert in the field, to sort of explain like why exactly LLMs work the way they do and why they produce the results that they do and like why do they scale that way. There are obviously explanations, but not explanations that most of us can truly get our head around. And I think that's sort of fascinating and a little creepy and a little interesting. I think in the very practical terms, the areas where I think AI will really, really meaningfully impact like MSPs and IT providers are things like improving the quality of sort of like support communication. That's an area where like a semi-automated assist from your help desk tool to help your junior staff produce higher quality, more detailed stuff. There's already some examples of that. The collaboration between your team and these sort of AI tools so that they're getting kind of served information that's more relevant. I think that's an area that's super meaningful. I think also some of the like analysis, obviously summaries are some of the areas that these tools are fantastic at. I'm sure all of us have been on phone calls or video calls with like Blue Dot or some sort of AI system that produces like shockingly accurate, like we all agreed to do these 5 things and there they are. That was like, that did as good a job as I could at summarizing the call. So I definitely think there's some really interesting sort of like tactical uses now, and I'm curious to see how those evolve. I'm also a little nervous about, what that means. I think there's this joke in the world at large of like, I didn't really have like, it would really help. What I really want is a technology solution that helps me not have to write poetry anymore. Like that was not the area I was trying to like remove from my docket. So, it's like maybe like, do the laundry or something is more compelling for a robot than having it write poetry. But alas, poetry is probably one of the things that's going to get better at first.
Well, it is fascinating. It's interesting. I keep one on the side of my desk open all the time too. And sometimes I'll just feed into it, just like, banter the conversation. And again, I think part of it is like, and even I have this conversation with my college son. I'm like, hey, use it to help your own critical thinking, right? Like it's
Absolutely.
not meant to give you the answers. I'm like, treat it like a politician, right? Take whatever they say with a grain of salt from either
Mm-hmm.
side, right? But it's really what I've found it most impactful is helping improve my critical thinking, right? It's almost like bouncing questions off of it and then seeing the answers come back. And it helps me formulate a better question to ask, but it's really almost helping myself internally to get to where I want to go. It's just having someone kind of help prompt and bounce those off of. I don't know. It's
I think we used to have a workshop series called Working Yellow. Yellow is our corporate color. Working Yellow was sort of this kind of like project management workshop thing that we would give to new hires, and we would do to some nonprofits and other organizations sort of as a service. And it was sort of the initial kind of idea was like basically like how to think about planning a project, how to think about like successfully executing what you plan to do, and then how to collaborate. That was sort of the 3 tent poles. And one of the things that I kind of really enjoyed about it and found interesting is like there was this idea early on in the planning that really resonated for me that I felt like was a really important thing to say, which is we used to kind of use like if you don't write it down, it doesn't count. People do a lot of planning things where they like ruminate and obsess in their own head. but they never actually take the stuff out of their head and look at it. And one of the things that I think an AI model in that context is really helpful for is it kind of gets these things out of your head into something else. And so there's a lot of like planning, figuring out, I'm sure we've all had experiences where you talk to a friend and you form an opinion that's different than you kind of had before you started testing these ideas. And I feel like AI is super interesting for that idea. It's like you can have a conversation where you're like, I think this is what I think, but if I talk to somebody and they ask me questions about it, do I continue to think that? So that I think is an area that's very compelling. It's, even a sort of pseudo therapy style bot can sort of help you with that, but these more sophisticated models are even more effective at helping you kind of form those ideas and evolve them.
Yeah, and it's going to be fascinating to see it, the speed of change, right? As we get better and better. We talked, I think, even before we got on today, and I just was commenting that even just using, one of the chat GPTs, that I've seen it exponentially get better over the last, several weeks.
Yeah.
And I think that speed of change and improvement is what's going to be fascinating to see. But
super interesting. Yeah, we specifically picked December 5th for the AI talk because I was like, I want to wait till we're at least close to the end of the year. I feel like there's so many crazy things happening and remarkable things happening that it's like, let's get to the far side of what seems like these current projections. So I'm sure there'll be wackier things in 2025, but it seemed like now was too soon. Whatever we say today will be wrong tomorrow.
agree. Well, listen, as we look to wrap up, can you walk us through the path of what it would look like for a new client that, comes into your, ecosystem and comes to you maybe for help, and just for an understanding of, what would be, obviously kind of a next step, but really just a understanding of what that process typically looks like when a prospect or a new client comes to work with you guys.
I mean, some of this is probably pretty boilerplate, but new people tend to reach out via email or sometimes a form on our website or reach out to somebody on our team. Obviously, many of our clients come to us as referrals, so they have some understanding of what we do. But even for those who come through some sort of circuitous path and don't know us personally, the first thing they generally do is start a conversation with Sarah, who's our client services coordinator, and typically Jeremy, who's our director of client services, and or myself and Sarah will hop on a phone call, usually a 20-minute, half an hour phone call, and just kind of talk through what brought them to us and kind of like understand what their scale is and like how they're thinking about approaching the thing that brought them to want to talk to us. And often the outcome of that conversation is a series of additional conversations, sometimes with our CTO or director of technology services. And sometimes it's sort of like, hey, here's a proposal. Often there's sort of a bit of a fork in the road. Organizations are like, we're trying to solve this problem and we know kind of this part of it, but we don't know that part. And so for many organizations, the first thing we try to do is basically get them to buy into this idea of like, if you want to engage in this process with us, it starts with an assessment, and we kind of take a step back from the day to day and say like, let's lift out all these rocks, look underneath them, and see what's there. Let's see how cleaned up stuff is. Obviously, for a smaller organization, that's a relatively brief process, sometimes only a few weeks, and for larger organizations, that might take months. But our hope is to use one of these assessment processes as a chance to come back and say like, hey, these things are great. This stuff you were kind of worried about, that's actually in really good shape. Like all you need to do is hit these 2 checkboxes and you're going to meet that requirement. However, there's this other thing that like, there's a server sitting in that room that nobody remembers what it does anymore. And it looks like that might be old accounting data from only 3 years ago. Like that's a problem you're going to need to solve. So often that assessment really highlights sort of unexpected things that are part of the sort of strategic thinking about budgets and resources. That's one of the fun parts, I think, for me, is sort of beginning to try to understand in those first conversations, like what and how people kind of how much they have their head around what they want to do. And I feel like a lot of our great relationships are coming to us because there's like a driving force, but it's not clear how to actually solve that problem. Again, growth or change is the area I think we use as our kind of like centerpiece, because often it's like an organization that is like maybe a virtual CISO has come in and they have a relatively new CTO who's like, you need to overhaul all this stuff. And the person's just like, oh goodness, I don't even know how. I only have 3 people. How could I possibly overhaul this 1,000-person organization in 6 months? And it's like, oh, we can help you with that. So that's an area where like not just figuring out how to do it, but also kind of like figuring out where the resources would come from, all the way to smaller organizations that are just like, hey, I don't want to think about this stuff. I'd really love to have a kind of a partner who I basically have a quarterly business review and then just like don't have to really worry anymore about like what's happening with all these things. I got a bunch of cybersecurity tick marks I'm being told I got to hit, but I don't know what that means. So those are the two areas and the two ways that we often see organizations go, but it all starts with this first little half an hour phone conversation.
Well, good. Well, and as you mentioned, it usually happens via email or website, and this is a good time for you to go ahead and plug those as well as where they can learn more about you and follow you, which I assume is on LinkedIn. But plug away.
LinkedIn's great, and Macktez, MACKTEZ.com is our website. There's a page on that website that has a form if you want to send us an email. And my email address is also on LinkedIn. Happy to take emails from people personally. I'm one of those people who just enjoys conversation and meeting people, and so I'm always happy if you think it might be an interesting conversation in there where don't hesitate to reach out.
Well, I appreciate the conversation we've had today. I've enjoyed it, so I can only imagine that would be my first choice to reach out to. So, but no, I really appreciate your time today. I'm looking forward to having you back after December so we can see what has transpired between then and your workshop. So
yeah, I look forward to that. And I should probably plug those if you, there's a link on our website, but it's lu.ma/Macktez, luma.macktez, or luma/Macktez is the kind of event planning. And we actually have an event coming up in about a month that's on code and play, which is a really fun, interesting, it's a ITP professor who just had a book come out on sort of like code and nature and playing with code and thinking about it not just as a kind of like a purely analytical thing, but something that's got a little more life and a little more vitality. He's a really fun guy. And then the conversation in December 5th is with Ida Benedetto, who's a fantastic person who does some really interesting experiential marketing and event planning and transformative kind of experience design. And we'll be talking again about AI. So that'll be super fun.
Well, good. Well, for those that aren't as fast writing, we'll go ahead and put all the links for all of those into the notes down below somewhere here. But
I hope my exuberance doesn't make everything I say illegible, but hopefully it comes through.
Well, that's what the AI note bots are for.
Perfect.
Well, no, I appreciate your time. Thanks again for coming on the show. We'll look forward to catching with you again.
Absolutely, Terry. Great pleasure. Wonderful to meet you. Have a great day.